give people another minute or so and we can get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Velero community meeting for June 11th, 2024 for the US and Europe time zones. So for overall status, last week, RC2 for Velero 1.14 was created. I believe it was just about a week ago today. My understanding is as soon as enough testing has been done with this, if there's no blockers found, that should become the final release. If we do end up with blockers, then we may need an RC3. I don't have any recent updates as far as I know, we're on track. I don't have a date right now as to, I don't know if anyone else here on the call has any more information, but I'd expect relatively soon to have
Scott, hey,
yes?
Scott. I only see RC1 in the release page, by the way.
RC1?
I only see RC1. So I don't know if RC2 is released. RC2,
I was just looking at
RC1.
that before the call. If you go to the Velero releases, should be, I saw RC2 right at the top.
Yeah,
Oh,
RC2. It's
Okay,
there.
okay.
Let me share the link.
Yeah, I believe it was on the 4th of June. It was released.
Very strange. Okay, still seeing RC1. Okay.
It's under Velero releases.
Right, in the GitHub, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Just for
I think
notes,
sorry,
I can see just RC1, but I can see on text RC2.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry,
just,
Daniel. What were you saying?
Was still a draft, so I just published it. Sorry.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
got it. Yeah.
I see it now. Yeah, I see it now. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, so Daniel, since you're on, what's the plan right now in terms of finishing RC2 testing and date for the final release?
Yeah, today we are seeing some because the Monday was a public holiday in China, and today we are seeing some flakiness in the pipeline. But I think after we fix it, we will be tagging the GA for 1.14.
Okay, got it. So it sounds like no problems in the code so far, just kind of infrastructure issues to work through first.
Correct.
Okay, sounds great. Okay. And I guess Shubham, oh, sorry. Also, for 1.15, we've now started the process of collecting requirements and candidates. So if you have any issues that you want to be considered for 1.15, please tag those as 1.15 candidates. Daniel, what's the time frame for trying to get that done?
Yeah, we'll have a weekly meeting tomorrow. I'll update the wiki page, but my roughly estimation is that it will be GA'd around late October, early November, so within this year.
Yeah, but in terms of the timeline for when people ought to get their candidates tagged by, is there a specific time for that, or is it just kind of an ongoing thing at this point?
Yeah, currently it's an ongoing thing, and as previous releases, I think I'll propose the date for the milestone, like feature freeze, feature complete, etc. We have several weeks for trialing the candidates.
Got it. Okay.
But I think if there are any big items like the item block we want to introduce, and from our side, we want to make the data mover a microservice.
Yep.
So that we can launch a pod anywhere for the movement. Those should be planned earlier.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll go and make sure that anything on my end and for the rest of the Red Hat, we'll tag the important ones as soon as possible.
Yeah, yeah. And currently the GA date will be October. Yeah.
Okay, Shubham.
Yeah, I think last week we faced one issue in which we're trying to take a backup without pods and then trying to restore it. Basically, if it's a CSI snapshot backup restore and pods are excluded, and at the same time the storage classes wait for first consumer, the restore was failing in the finalizing phase. So the finalizing phase was introduced in Velero 114, I think. So in that we try to patch the PV if there is a difference in spec. So in that phase, let's say if the storage class is wait for first consumer and there are no pods restored, so it will be in pending state. Because of that, the finalizing state, we were hitting the context timeout issue and it was partially failing. So what this PR does is it gives more information in such a scenario in error case, so that the users could take appropriate action, like they could change the storage class to immediate if they don't want to include pods, or they could include pods if
Yeah.
that's a non-issue for them.
Okay,
So
so
it's okay. So it's okay for us to fail the restore in this case, huh?
Yeah, I think so, because of the storage class behavior.
Yeah. I mean, I think failing. I think this is similar to the data mover case. We already had this problem with data mover, where again, if it was wait for first consumer and you didn't have a pod, then the PV wouldn't bind to the PVC, and we wouldn't succeed. It's just that I think in 1.13, if it was CSI only and not data mover, we didn't fail. In this case, now we're still failing, but it's only as far as we can tell from our testing. This only fails with the combination of there's no pod for the PVC and it's wait for first consumer. And then this PR, as I'm understanding it correctly, if I am, doesn't change the failure case. What it does is if we do get an error here, we check if this is the error and it's wait for first consumer, then we provide more information in the error message so that the user can understand. Because what was kind of confusing when we first saw this error message, why is this failing?
Yeah.
Turns out it was only failing for this particular volume binding mode. So we're going to provide more information to the user so they can understand why it's failing and what they need to do to get rid of the error.
Okay. Yeah, but there could be another possibility, like it's just slow for some reason that the
That's true. I mean, this doesn't prove anything. What we're kind of trying to do is saying, because we only change the error message if it's wait for first consumer. And basically what we're saying here is if you have wait for first consumer volume binding mode and you don't have a pod, then we expect this to fail.
Okay.
Obviously,
So
if that's not the case, then
yeah, and in this case, right, Daniel, it won't even go till the patch call. This is before that itself, because patch call is only done if PVC is not in pending state, right? So we can rule out the server slow case.
Okay.
yes. So as far as I'm seeing this, basically anything that erred before this PR is still going to error. The only difference
Yeah.
is in certain circumstances, we're going to give a little more information in an error message just to help direct the user as to what they might be able to do. And maybe they can't do anything about it. But in some cases, they say, oh, wait a minute. My volume binding mode is wait for first consumer. Do I really need that? If they don't need that, they can change it and then it's going to work. If they do need that, then they're going to have to figure out how to get pods in there. Because we've had this problem with data mover before. Wait for first consumer volume binding mode is incompatible with backing up and restoring with no pods. It's just not. There's not really a way around it because that's trying to fix a problem with storage topology. If you have storage that's only available in certain nodes, you got to wait till your application pod is up so we know what storage to provision. And so we really can't try to work around that because that could end up with bigger problems. So all we can do is warn the user, hey, here's what we think is going on. Here's how you might fix it.
Yeah. I think that sounds good to me.
Okay. And did anybody else have any status updates or discussion topics? I don't see anything on the agenda.
As for the retrying versus failed backup or restore during reconcile, we had some brief discussion internally today, and Yonghui said he's gonna follow up and add more comments to that.
Okay.
Currently, I think his preference is a retry. He has some strong belief that if we fail that in the reconcile, it will introduce a lot of problem in other cases. But let's wait for his comments.
Okay,
yeah.
so he's thinking maybe we do want to go ahead and do the retry as we originally were proposing.
Yep.
Okay, we still one thing I know talking internally with Tiger and others this past week, one thing I realized was even if we retry, if we hit that timeout and the API server is still down, we're still going to have to do the requeue and fail. But if we do the retry first, that reduces the chances of that needing to happen. The thing is that we have to pretty much completely avoid the situation where a backup or restore is in progress forever, because that's just, it's an invalid state and it confuses users. But if we can do a retry before we requeue to fail, that should reduce the chances, and then it will only happen in cases where the API server is actually down. And if it's actually down permanently, then it'll requeue and it won't actually, it'll keep requeuing, and at some point you realize, hey, this is broken. And then you have to restart things and fix it. But that's but
yeah, but again, I think in our internal discussion, we believe that Velero cannot handle the case API servers down very well, and I don't think it can handle that very well. So I think we may need some discussion over here. Yonghui has some different idea, like introducing some external logic to handle that and keep it out of Velero, but I think we may need more discussion. But
I do agree that the reliability in that case, I mean, there's not much we can do, and like you said, there's a bunch of API server calls throughout the backup and the restore. If the list call fails, if the create call, there's nothing we can do about that. That's just going to fail. We did have some discussion with the support people that were working with the customer that hit this, and we got a little more information about this to understand what was going on. And so this is in a situation they're using what's called single node OpenShift, which is kind of OpenShift's architecture for edge environments. So it's a single node basically running the entire cluster. So you don't have high availability. And one of the features of this is that in terms of authentication keys, those things get updated periodically from a more central cluster. And unfortunately, right now, that's something that's not, we don't have much control over the timing. So this is a kind of an issue that affects other applications too, not just Velero. But it's something right now they really can't control when that happens. So, the suggestion last week was, well, don't do the backup or restore when the rekeying is happening. And we brought that up with them as well. And it is an ongoing issue. We'd love for that to, eventually get to the point where that can be more predictable, or, some
I don't think it's going to be predictable.
I know that's. I thought they'd said that there was some
if they update
ongoing issue.
If they update the mechanism, then it might be predictable.
Right, like whether it's predictable or whether there are events that happen ahead of time that let you know, those are the kinds of things that would improve usability for all applications in the future. But the reality is today that doesn't happen. That's not there. It may never be there. That's just kind of RFEs for the future. The reality right now is this can happen at any point. And to Daniel's point, Velero is not going to be resilient to being able to succeed in a backup or restore if it's happening in the middle. The best we can do is prevent our backup and restore from getting into an inconsistent state. So if it happens, for example, during the restore objects, those things are going to fail. That's fine. We get a partially failed restore. The user can then redo it. If it fails during this end point where we're updating the status, that's where things like retry and requeue, or some combination of those is needed, mostly to make sure that backup or restore is not stuck in progress forever, which doesn't tell the user anything. They need to know, hey, this is no longer being processed. You have to start over. It failed. So that's where the retry or requeue kind of helps us. Doesn't let Velero be reliable during that outage, but it does at least provide a kind of terminal state for that backup or restore, so the user can have their own tooling check for that status. And when it eventually goes to failed, if it does go to failed, they can rerun the backup or restore. If the retries succeed, then they don't need to do that. But again, all backups need to eventually go to completed or failed or partially failed. We need to get to that terminal state. Otherwise, the user has inaccurate information about what's going on in Velero.
Yeah, I think we discussed some other possibility, like write something into the BSL bucket, because that doesn't rely on the API server.
Yeah.
So so that Velero has a chance to check what the expected, what happened, when this in progress restore requeued.
But and Tiger had another idea. So we were talking about earlier this week, is we could even just do something in memory, so that there's some field in memory, and so when you requeue it, when Velero goes back and sees an in progress backup, it can check. Here's one that we tried to fix. That we tried. In other words, especially for backups, because at that point we've already uploaded the tarball, we've already uploaded the log, everything is there except the status field. So if we requeued that, we don't necessarily have to fail. We can instead, if whether it's in the bucket or it's in memory, it's somewhere that Velero, when the reconciler picks it up again, says, here's an in progress backup, let me check for this temporary, basically the update of what it should have patched.
Daniel, again, is that the preferred? Is that perhaps a preferred way of handling this, in your opinion?
Even in my discussion with Yunhui, we didn't reach agreement, so I expect there will be further discussion, and Yunhui said he will follow up with that. And I think for short term, if you really need a fix, is that possible to keep it in the downstream and patch in the customer's delivery, and we can continue the discussion in the upstream?
I mean, we can patch things to downstream. Our preference is always to go upstream first, because the risk for going downstream first is if the accepted solution upstream ends up being different than what we put in place, that makes it more complicated to sort of update things on our side. So yeah, I mean, one way or another, we're going to have to fix it for this customer. And worst case scenario for us is doing it downstream only. Ideally, we'll come up with at least part of the solution upstream, whether that's retrying, whether that's failing, understanding that the points where we try to, putting it in the S3 bucket or in memory to actually retry with the correct result might be harder to come to agreement on. And I'd be fine with that taking longer. We'll keep the discussion going, but I think first priority is to get a minimal fix upstream that prevents that backup from being in progress forever.
But if we are talking about minimal fix, sorry, I think it's probably harmless to add retry logic at the moment in the downstream, and we can discuss. I'm not saying that retry logic will never go upstream, but Yunhui mentioned a lot of possibilities. So I think that's going to be a relatively long discussion to before we reach agreement and have something on the upstream.
Just
if you have the retry in the downstream, that's stateless, and it's probably does no harm if there's something changed in the upstream and you eventually apply that in the downstream, right?
That is true. I don't disagree with any of that. I'm just saying, while we're figuring out what we need to do in downstream, because again, at the end of the day, at some point we have to get a fix out. We need to kind of continue this discussion upstream, because this is also going to be a problem for anyone in a Velero environment, especially in an edge environment where you're in a small cluster, without
That's my question. Daniel, do you know if you have any customers running in an edge-like single node scenario?
I think yes, but the this API server unavailability while Velero running, it's not on my radar at this moment.
Yeah. So the more context on that is that's a security feature of this deployment. that they're re-rolling those certs from time to time.
Yeah. I understand roughly the scenario, but if we know that the API server is unavailable at some point of time, we should avoid running backup or restore.
Problem is we don't know the timing of that's the part that I was kind of trying to ask them as well, and it sounds like again, my impression from the call, this may not be 100% correct. They're aware that there's an issue here. Long term, they do want to get to that point of predictability, but the reality right now is that the cert updates are pushed from a central cluster outside of these edge clusters, and the edge clusters don't have advanced notification. It kind of depends on the rollout schedule and everything else. So it's unfortunately when they're creating a Velero schedule, for example, for a backup, and they say, I wanted this to run at, midnight, there's no guarantee that during that time of backup, it won't have a recert. Likewise for a restore, because, again, I need to run a restore here. There's no guarantees right now. The best they can do is be reactive and have cooling in place to say, if that backup is not successful, we try it again. That way, if the rekeying does hit them, if the backup does fail, they can rerun a backup. Assuming that obviously if retries made it successful, that's fine, but that's not a guarantee either, because that outage can happen during restoring objects or during those list calls on the backup. And that case would result in a failure, even if we did the retries on the status updates. So they need tooling in place to be able to say, oh, this backup was not successful, we ran it again. And if the reason for the not successful was because that recertification, the cert refresh was happening, then the next backup would succeed. And if there was some update, some enhancement at some point where they had a schedule, they had even an event saying, hey, restart happening in 5 minutes, whatever, then they could react in their tooling to not run a backup or restore at that point. But that is not an option to them given the current architecture. And as far as I understand, this is kind of a function of the way the single node OpenShift environment works, and that is the OpenShift distribution for edge environments. So although this one particular customer is hitting it, it's potentially going to be hit by anybody running in a single node of OpenShift environment. And to Wes's point, it may also be possible for someone not on OpenShift, on some other kind of edge focused Kubernetes distribution, just because the nature of edge environments, single node environments, is you don't have highly available API servers. And the absence of a highly available API server, obviously, to your point, we're not going to make Velero fully resilient to that, to guarantee a successful backup if an outage happens. But I think at a minimum, what we want Velero to do is at least recognize the API server has gone down and not result in kind of invalid state. And the problem we're dealing with here really is the fact that the backup and restore controllers, as they're currently written, can't resume a backup. If Velero was able to reconcile in progress backup and finish, then that would solve this problem. But that's a long way from happening if it ever happens in Velero. So we have to kind of do something smaller now.
Yeah, I think for sure, probably the minimal changes to retry. And thinking about your scenario, I think after we introduce the microservice data mover, as long as user have a CSS snapshot, it's probably doable. But it's just we are just thinking about it. It's probably doable that Velero running on cluster A and do a backup for cluster B, as long as Velero have the cool config for cluster B, and still update its status in cluster A. So that probably can help in this case in the future. At this moment, if you need a quick fix, I would suggest you apply the retry downstream, and we can continue the discussion. And upstream is not totally against this retry approach, but yeah, there are some other case that Yunhui mentioned, and he will follow up with it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if he's got other ideas for how to fix it or other use cases here that we're not covering, I absolutely agree. We need that in the discussion. Let's figure that out and do it right upstream. I'm, you know, and I get it'll take a little bit of time to do that, and that may well put us at a deadline situation where we have to do something downstream first. That's fine, but I don't want to not consider the upstream discussion a priority as a result. And in other words, ideally we'd still get this, figured out soon enough for our needs.
Yeah.
But I don't want to rush something through and not do it right. So that's all I'm saying is that yes, like we can do this downstream first, and if we have to, we will. But in the meantime, let's continue this discussion upstream and resolve this, reasonably as soon as possible. Obviously, it's not a first priority here, but it's definitely something we'd like to come to an agreement on relatively soon so we can implement something.
Sure. I'll let you know, and I think he will be adding some comment probably tonight or tomorrow morning.
Okay, that sounds great.
Yep.
Okay, any other topics here? Sounds like that's it. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We'll have our meeting in the other the sort of US Beijing centric time zone next week at the normal time. Have a good week, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.